All right, we're back. It is COMP3025, Mobile and Pervasive Computing at Georgian in the winter 2017 semester. It's week 3, part 1 of our broadcast. I want to talk about Ionic a little bit today and do a little bit of installation, not too much. It's all command line stuff. We've done most of the installation at this point. Let me talk about some assumptions, I think, at week 3, assumptions at week 3. And I've talked assumptions before, but let's make some assumptions today, right? Assumptions are your command line all works perfectly at this point, right? You know how to use Git and GitHub. Your machine is ready to go for this kind of stuff. Again, I want to specify the following. When on the midterm, right, I'm going to give you an option to use any of the web technologies or mobile technologies you wish. So if you're somebody who's going to do something with iOS and you've been working with iOS the entire semester, I'm not going to make you switch to web technologies. That doesn't make any sense. If you're someone who's been working with Android, you can continue working with Android on the midterm, okay? So that's totally fine. And if you're someone working with web, obviously that's going to be the thing I'm showing you, so hopefully you'll be able to do that as well. So don't worry about the midterm. Whatever technology mobile-wise you want to use is perfectly acceptable, all right? And we'll talk about the stuff that's not acceptable. For example, on the web, there's a lot of frameworks that do things for you beyond the stuff that I've talked about. So please stick with the things that I've asked you to stick with, only because some of those frameworks may not work properly. And also from a deployment perspective, I may or may not ask you to do something like deploy something live, to a device or something like that. There might be some component of that. It really depends on how good we are in terms of putting things together and how far we get with the deployment stuff by midterm. Second half of semester, again, the option is we do an assignment 4 or hit a project. If we do a project, which will be a little bit larger, it'll be multi-stage, so a couple of releases. And by the end of semester, we should be able to get you build some kind of app or game. And I'm going to kind of give it to you whether you build a utility app at the end. That might be the option, or an actual game app, whatever you want to do. I highly recommend a game engine, all right, for this, only because we don't have any time to do it manually with SpriteKit if you're an iOS person, or some kind of and engine if you're an Android person, or even OpenGL, anything like that. I recommend against those technologies, only because it takes too long. However, if you're really intent on doing things at the low level, native, I'm not going to say no. I just want to see, I'm going to have to track your progress a little bit more closely, because you can be writing yourself into a black hole by the end of the semester. I don't want that. It means you'll never finish, right? Keep in mind when you think about projects, if you do build a game or any kind of utility app, please no puzzle games or role-playing games, okay? So please don't do those kind of things. It's insane, right? You won't finish. They're just not doable within half a semester, right? It's not a bit, maybe save those things for another time, right? So if you're going to make a game, make some kind of side-scrolling shooter or some kind of top-down shooter. Or if you're going to make a platformer, if you're thinking about doing that kind of stuff, it's fine. But make it so that it's fairly straightforward to take care of. I can coach anybody on any of the technologies, Unreal or on Unity, or even in OpenGL if you really want to go there. I don't recommend it. From an asset perspective, when you're thinking about assets for games and utility apps, like if you're going to download buttons and all those kind of things, I'm not asking you to make anything, right? So you don't have to make buttons or assets, right? You can get things from open source places. And I'm talking about this now in week 3 because I want you to start thinking about it. I want you to start thinking about it in your mind, what final thing am I going to build? Am I going to build a game? Am I going to build a utility? What kind of utility do I want? There'll be some structure around the utility, right? For example, you might have some kind of data connection, because we're going to talk about if we can do things with data. One of the kind of keen ways we always connect with data, and I think I brought this up before, but I'll talk about it again maybe if we haven't, is connecting to something called Firebase, right? So for people who haven't used Firebase before, it's kind of a database-less server. It's really weird. Or serverless database, some people call it that as well. And if I look at the connections for Firebase, Firebase is almost like a NoSQL database. You can see that there's data documentation for both native iOS, Android, and web. So I mean, depending on what you use, Firebase is a great backend to store your data, right? Especially on devices. Some people may choose to use something native, like on iOS you might choose, or Android you might choose SQLite. That's also very common if you want to store some simple data. And when it comes to Unity, if you're going to do a Unity game or Unreal, you got to think about how to store things like high score if you're going to have a scoring system for your game and those kind of things. So there might be a component that I put in, like you might have some kind of data component where you store something on the device or off device. So keep thinking about that. What kind of utility app or whatever are you going to build? And there'll be some structure around that. It won't be a simple BMI app. Let's put it that way. Okay, you can't just put a BMI app together, right? So think about the stuff that you have to build. All right. Let's talk about the Ionic stuff today. So again, when I talk about Ionic, if you go to the Ionic website, I've kind of talked about this first day. We talked about the 3 mobile technologies that are kind of common out there right now. It was Ionic, jQuery Mobile, right? And there's a smaller technology that's been out there. There's others too. The other one is Ratchet. I believe it's Ratchet.io, if I'm not wrong. Ratchet.js, which is Go Ratchet, right? So those are very, very common and popular frameworks. I would say that the most popular these days is Ionic, right? So jQuery Mobile, I mean, it was for many years been around. At least for me, I've been using it since around 2011, right? So kind of, quite a bit of time now. We're looking at 2017 now. So they're around 6 years. Like it's kind of a mature technology that's out there for building stuff with PhoneGap and Cordova. Cordova more of a more recent thing compared to PhoneGap. PhoneGap, Adobe, remember, has been using PhoneGap since like Dreamweaver 8, something like that. It's been around for a while, right? And it's been something like where you build your mobile app with Dreamweaver and PhoneGap, and you come up with an Android and iOS application. And that was back then, right? Way back then. So it's been around for a while. Ionic is kind of the new kid on the block that kind of includes things like Angular 2, TypeScript, and on the back end, things like I said, Firebase, very, very popular kind of combinations, right? And we're going to discover those. We're going to go through those things throughout this course. So I'm going to connect you with Firebase, and we're going to do these things. And you can also connect. At the same time, when I do this stuff with Firebase, I want you to think about connecting your iOS or Android application with Firebase if you're going to do something native, right? Because I think it's going to be a challenge for you. And again, Firebase is very well documented from a back-end perspective, so you'll have no issues. You should have no issues, and put it that way, right? Okay, so let's take a look. So Ionic is where we're going to start. I've got a little PowerPoint that we're going to work with, right? So again, I have lesson 3, which I kind of put up. Now this, as we move forward with this book, again, last week we talked about JavaScript, a little bit of TypeScript, some closure stuff that we did last week. Talked about classes and those things with TypeScript a little bit, as well as more jQuery Mobile and how to build your user interface, that kind of stuff. This week we're going to kind of talk about we're going to build a Hello World app with Ionic, a little bit different, right? And how to include things like a build for iOS or Android. And we're also going to do emulate things on both iOS with Xcode and with Genymotion for Android. So it's going to hit those key things. And if you're an Android person, again, I highly recommend Genymotion is a better way of emulating than the built-in emulator with Android Studio. It is better. I have to say, the Android Studio emulator, it's gone through a lot of transitions and improvements, but I still think Genymotion is just faster and more efficient, right? And they've got a lot of builds. It's kind of a professional tool set that people are using still. If the Android Studio emulator was that good, then there wouldn't be a market for something like Genymotion. Genymotion is not free in the professional version because they have a lot of other additional things you can do with Genymotion. But for us, you can use it, to create your apps again from an educational perspective for free. We'll talk about that. All right. So again, I'm not going to make the case, but this is right from the books that I was using. This is not going to make the case for the real reason why to use hybrid apps. I think we've made the case a number of times, right? So let's talk about the Ionic framework a little bit. It is a framework. Okay, so again, did we talk about what the difference between a framework and an API is? Did we ever go there, right? What's the difference between a framework and an API? Anybody? There's a difference. Actually, there's three. There's a framework, an API, and a platform, right? Those three things, right? So an API, what's an API? What's an API? What's an API? What does it stand for? What does it stand for? Anybody? Yes.
Application programming interface.
Application programming interface. So, okay, that's good. And usually what it means is it's something we can plug into, right? We might have some classes or libraries or whatever we want to plug into, but I want you to think about it as modular, right? So I can use some of it or all of it or none of it, right? It's an API allows us to use classes that are built and tested by somebody else, right? And that could be for even whether you're using it for iOS or Android development or the web. What's a framework? A framework is more of a structured, I don't know what can I say. There's a bit more structure on the framework, and you have to use a framework in a certain way. It's more opinionated. You can't decide not to use certain aspects of it, right? So a framework kind of forces you to work in with a certain workflow, let's put it that way, and use certain plugins that are required, right? A platform, and I want you to think of a platform like Node. Node.js is a platform, all right? It's different than a framework because it can house many frameworks, right? So you can choose which framework to use, and that's why it's called a platform. And when we go back to platform as a service, that whole idea, right? We think about things like Azure, Microsoft Azure, Node, those kind of things. You might say software as a service or something like that. But I think platform as a service as I can house more than one framework or use of an API. So Ionic is a framework, which means it's opinionated, all right? It's not like, it's kind of like jQuery Mobile. If you've done jQuery Mobile before and you use classes, or if you used Bootstrap before, to the CSS that's part of Bootstrap, then you're going to be happy with Ionic from a CSS perspective because it's very similar in terms of, hey, I want to use these CSS classes that are built in. jQuery Mobile have the same thing. If you're a jQuery Mobile person, you notice that there's some classes that you can use to make your app look like it's a native app, right? Same thing with Ionic. So again, Ionic, we're going to use Ionic 2, right? There's no point in using Ionic 1 anymore. If you can if you want, when you download and install Ionic, but we're going to use Ionic 2. Ionic 2 uses the Requestanimationframe, which, by the way, is used by all more modern libraries when it comes to any kind of graphics. An example of that would be something like Create.js. Create.js uses Requestanimationframe as well. And I've used Create.js to build all kinds of web games in the past. So it kind of increases the performance when it comes to the way it delivers things with Requestanimationframe, right? Lots of default styles. We'll talk about that, and use of Sass, which makes building and modifying your presentation even easier. So the great thing about Angular 2, and I'll talk about positives and negatives about Angular 2, because we need to learn a little bit of Angular 2 in order for us to do Ionic. So that's part of the learnings. It won't be this week. It's just too much to do in 1 week. But we need to know TypeScript. We talked about TypeScript last week. So we need to incorporate TypeScript when we use Angular. Can't do Angular 2 without TypeScript. You can with JavaScript. It's just not the same. It doesn't deliver the same punch, right? And again, we talked about how TypeScript last week was a superset of ECMAScript 6 or ECMAScript 2015, which is the latest version of JavaScript, okay? So no more controllers and directives with AngularJS 2. They've kind of removed those things, and they've gone to more of a component approach, okay? So directives behind, and the reason for that was, again, and by the way, this took years to kind of settle, and that's why, like I said last week, React has been on the rise, and why I want to try and think about covering things like React Native or something like Electron, later on in this course, because I want to talk about those kind of things, which are very, very popular frameworks right now. Well, React's not really a framework; it's more of an API. But anyways, it took a long time for them to evolve from Angular 1 to Angular 2 because they took this whole component-based approach, right? Other things they took out of Angular 2, look at that, is they took out the whole idea of, wow, sorry, I hate when I mess up like that. They took away the scope kind of context, if you will, because scope was very difficult to troubleshoot. That was an issue. And Angular 2 promises when it comes to using promises. And I think you guys we covered promises, and I think somewhere. Do you guys not cover promises anywhere with jQuery or anything? You may have covered promises more in the modern stuff that we've covered. So it allows better performance, than before. And again, you can use any language, although they recommend TypeScript, right? Thinking about how to make a hello world with, to bootstrap our app. And when we say bootstrap, I don't mean using Bootstrap CSS framework. When we say bootstrap, a lot of times, especially with Angular, we're talking about how to kick off or hook into Angular. That's what bootstrapping means, right? So we're using bootstrap, the keyword bootstrap, in a different way. It's not the bootstrap framework, the CSS framework that we're talking about. One great thing is that Ionic provides these scaffolds, right, for you. And there's 3 major scaffolds that allows us to build, and we'll talk about what those are. They call it kind of a skeleton to build apps quicker, so from a rapid application development. Again, and that makes sense, because if I'm going to build things with Ionic and hybrid app technology, like I'm using web to prototype, I'm prototyping, which means a lot of times I want to build things quick, right? It's not because I don't want to have things, if I'm doing modern or common tasks, I don't want them, me to go through the, building things from scratch. And Ionic allows that. We can just we can choose a template, if you will, and then it'll scaffold out the basic template for us, all right? And that's very similar to things like if I build an Android application or iOS, and I choose in the iOS single or multi-view application, same thing with Android. You can choose what kind, same idea, it's a templating. And whereas PhoneGap allows some of that, right? I mean, if I go back to jQuery Mobile, there is no real templating, right? It's not like I can go in jQuery Mobile, download a template, and away I go, right? So that's where jQuery Mobile, again, being an older technology, it's more component-based. You can use some of it, all of it, or none of it. Whereas, here in this Ionic framework, you need to use something to start with. You could start with a blank app as well, but why? I mean, it's better to modify. It's easier for me to modify and remove components than it is for me to add, right? From a development environment perspective, we need to do some command line stuff. And one of the things we have to download and install to use Ionic is Cordova, which, again, if I looked at Cordova and PhoneGap, they're kind of the same thing. It's almost like 2 different projects that split off. Again, they're owned by the same people, Adobe, right? Or they've been developed in line with the same group of people. It's just that they've been developed separately. Lately, they've come together, and so we always talk about PhoneGap and Cordova in a similar kind of way. But you notice that there's PhoneGap. We talked about PhoneGap build last week, and there is something similar on the Ionic side, almost like a cloud build technology that we're going to talk about. And by the way, just as an aside, and I don't want me to digress too much, but if you're using something like Unity to build your game at the end, there is a Unity cloud build that you can do. So if you're looking at building a game, if that's what you're doing, they do have that technology as well, and it's being offered more and more. So how do I build my stuff on the cloud? That's becoming more prevalent because, it cuts down some of the things we need to do and the technology we need to have built into our machines in order for me to deploy something, right? One of the things we can do with a simulator is we can create almost like this idea of a live reload, right? And we did it manually. If you've been with me on COMP3025, or if you did Rich's advanced web application development, right? Advanced web programming, then we used technologies to live reload a web page, right? So when we change something, boom, it changes the web page. We're using similar technology when it comes to Cordova. When we live reload into an app, it'll just, anytime we make a change, it'll reboot your app automatically. So it's kind of from a workflow perspective, it improves your time frame. Okay, so what do we need? We need Node.js. So by now, remember last week or the week before, the first week we got together, I said, hey, download and install Node.js. That should be something. Remember we talked about assumptions? You should be done with that part. Node.js should be finished, right? You should have other things in there like with like, for example, Bower and Gulp and all those kind of things. We talked about those kind of installations, but we'll get more to it if we need to. But let's talk about the way we do it. So we're going to do this. So please go to your command line. We're doing iOS or Android. I still want you to follow the lessons only because this is something I want you to know how to do as well. So please go on your terminal and do this. Go npm install -g Cordova, -g for global. That's what the npm is, the command, right? So no package manager install -g Cordova. That's one part. Ionic is another, and then iOS sim, which is the iOS simulator. Okay, so actually you're installing 3 pieces on one line, right? So please go ahead and do that. I've already done this, right? But I'd like you to try and install this with your -g. Now, if you're using a Mac and you haven't installed npm with Homebrew, then you won't be able to do just this piece, right? You'll have to include the sudo command or sudo command, right? So hopefully you've installed npm and node with Homebrew if you're a Mac person. If you aren't, you have nothing to worry about. If you're a PC person and you work native on command prompt, you're fine. Again, I don't recommend command prompt. I recommend PowerShell on PC. I think it's a little bit more robust than command prompt in terms of functionality. So let's do this now. And again, to test that, if I was going to go to my terminal, so I'm testing all the technology. So you should be able to do on your terminal at this point, I should be able to do npm -v. Gives me my version. I'm at 4.11. I should be able to do node -v, which is I'm at 7.4, right? Those are the things I've upgraded. And I upgraded with Homebrew as well, if you're a Mac person. I should be able to do, if I was going to type Cordova, right? And if I went to -v, does it give me a v? I got Cordova version 6.5, so that's one thing you should be able to do. If I go to Bower, right, -v, 1.8 for Bower, these are all the things you should be able to do now on your command line. If you can't do this or you get an unrecognized command, you need to go back to video number 1, right? and you need to update your environment variables, right? Because something's not right with your installation. I should be able to do git ---- version. I should be able to do that too, right? All those things should be available on your terminal or command prompt at this point in time, right? And same thing with the Ionic. If I go to Ionic -v, if I do this, I should have a version of Ionic that I've installed. Okay? So please do the installation commands, and so we can move on. And I'm just going to take a pause for a second to wait. Has everyone done this? It takes a bit of time, actually. If you try and do this now, it's not going to happen like this, right? It'll take time for you to do all these installations. Now, what if you don't have your own machine? What if you're working with the school machine in front of you? Sometimes the school machine in front of you will fail. It will not allow you to do terminal commands and install stuff. And again, that's why I recommend, if you don't have your own laptop, but you have a desktop at home, install TeamViewer. I'm okay with that, especially even on an exam, and you want to remotely control your machine. I'm perfectly fine with doing that on a midterm or something, right? So you can get things done. As long as you hand stuff in at the end, doesn't matter to me, right? So please don't be hamstrung by the machine in front of you. If you don't have a laptop and you have a desktop at home, make sure that you can connect. It's easy to do an install of TeamViewer on these machines. It'll take it. It'll work properly, right? And thanks to the team at TeamViewer to still keep it free for personal use. All right. So again, so integrated development environments. Some people want to use Xcode for iOS. We talked about that. Android Studio for Android. Visual Studio Code is what I'm going to be using again. You can also use Sublime Text. I'm not going to go too much into that. We've talked about that already, and that's a bit of a review. What about Visual Studio? And there's another option, and I keep on skirting it, but I want to talk about it one more time, which is using Xamarin. If you're someone who wants to kind of learn how to use Xamarin Forms, that is definitely another option these days. Xamarin with Visual Studio and Microsoft C# to build cross-platform applications. I got to mention it here. I'd be remiss of me not to say it again. This is pretty viable stuff. It works cross-platform. There is Xamarin Studio available for both Mac OS and Windows. So please, if you're interested in doing that kind of stuff, let me know if you need help with installation. I have to warn you, however, this is a 30 gigabyte install. All right, just putting it out there. Remember, Microsoft always makes it nice and fat for everybody, right? But there's a reason for it, because they include a bunch of extra tools and tool sets and so on. And I mean, if they've reduced it because they've integrated some of this with Visual Studio. But if you don't have a Visual Studio installed, 30 gigabytes. All right. So just putting it out there to you guys. Okay, let's get back to this. So you've installed everything. I'm going to make assumptions again now that you've installed. You've done all this work. Has anyone not finished this install? I'll wait a little longer if I have to. Okay, you're still working on it. It takes time. Like there's a bit of installation. You know, I just want to call it. I want to use the old school term, guru meditation. That's happening right now, right? Guru meditation actually was a way of what we called the blue screen of death back in the day, right? Guru meditation, right? Look it up on Wikipedia. You'll be surprised what it means from a computer perspective. But for now, what we're doing is we're just waiting for something to happen, right? Sometimes guru meditation means we're never going to get a response too, right? Because we just keep on meditating into the ether. We're trying to connect with the cosmos with guru meditation. And sometimes when I watch the beach ball happening on my Mac, right, or if I look at the hourglass on my PC, I'm like, God damn it, guru meditation, right? I'm just waiting forever, right? And I got to reboot my machine or stop processes. If you're tempted to stop your installation when you're doing this kind of stuff, nothing's wrong with your machine. There's a lot of stuff to install here, right? Because it's installing different piece parts to connect with Android and iOS. All right, so how do we build this Hello World app? I'm going to kind of go forward, and then we'll talk about how to do that. Again, I talked about 3 templates that you can use. Obviously, blank doesn't make any sense if you're going to start for blank. You know what? It's okay to do blank. So it's a sample page with nothing on it, minimal code. That's one of the templates. Tabs, right? Multiple pages with roots built in. So all the routing and stuff on Angular, it's already pre-done for you for multiple pages, which is cool. And then the last one is a left-right menu with a center content area, side menu, and that's great for tablets, right? So those are the 2 things. So again, what's the most common one that I'm going to probably use? Tabs, right? Because that's that kind of a built-in, almost like a little, menu that I can go with, a little, toolbar, and I'm ready to go. So how do I build it? These are the commands, and again, if you follow the PowerPoint, it tells you how to do it. So I do Ionic. Start is the keyword that I'm going to be using, or the action word. I call it something, and if I was going to build a blank application, that's the template at the end. So that's the way it works. So Ionic start, whatever the name of the app that you want to make is. Usually you want to put this somewhere on your desktop or inside of a development folder. And then -- version 2, right, whatever you want to call it. -- version 2 is V2, Ionic 2. If you omit the -- V2, it's Ionic 1 you're building, right? And I don't recommend that at this point. I mean, you're going to use Ionic 1 and Angular 1, which is, again, a little bit older and a little bit slower. And we want to talk about some of the new stuff. If we're going to use Angular, might as well use the latest version, right? So please make sure you do this -- V2 at the end. That's what it stands for. All right, so let's do this together. So if I was going to do it, so here's my terminal. I want to kind of navigate. Has anyone not done the installation piece? Still? Yeah, okay. I know it takes time, right? It's a problem. So I'm going to navigate to my desktop, right? Here's my desktop. And what I want to do is make an app. I'm going to call it the name of our, of our lesson today. And I also want to share it with you on GitHub. All right, so I'm going to talk about this, how to do this, right? So again, we're going to do Ionic start. Those are the 2 things. Ionic is the framework. Start is the word that I'm going to be using. The name of my app. So I'm going to kind of do a lowercase because I know I'm going to be using package.json. So lowercase COMP3025 -W2017 lesson 3. That's my app name, right? It's not really that descriptive, but we are doing a hello world, so who cares? And then what kind of what are we building? If I was going to do it, let's start with tabs. And by the way, let me do 3A. Maybe we'll do a 3B to give you some other options, right? We'll do a tabs application and then -- V2. Well, lots of stuff. I know it sounds like a long line, and you're not going to remember. You don't have to remember this stuff, right? I mean, you can always look it up on the documentation. We're going to go to the documentation for for Ionic today. Notice that I am on my desktop, which means it's going to build on my desktop, right? So let me try this out. Okay, it's downloading, and the first part is you've got to have an internet connection to download the packages that you need from Ionic. Okay, so that's the first part. Now, depending on your installation, it may ask you if you've registered for Ionic. Registration for Ionic is optional. You don't have to do it, right? Just like registration for PhoneGap is optional. You don't have to do it. If you're going to develop applications on the cloud with Ionic, and there's a cloud build service with Ionic as well, then registration is required. Okay. Okay, it looks like I'm done. So my Ionic app is ready to go, right? Gives me a little, some music icons, right? Which is kind of cool for me. And then it says how to run your app in the browser. Great for initial development. It tells you right here, run on a device, right? Ionic run iOS, Android or browser. And then share your app with the testers, where I can use Ionic View, and that's the cloud build, like I talked about before. When we do Ionic View. And you can also download and install an application, the View app, on Android and iOS to test locally without any kind of certificates, which is totally cool, right? Okay, are you guys all with me now, or are we still behind? You're still going? You're still kind of cranking stuff out, or are you with me?
Still installing that.
You're at your laptop is what? Right. Okay, I can't repeat that online, but that's fine, right? So you're still going, installing?
Yeah, still installing.
Damn, eh? Yeah? What did I tell you? All right. Okay, well, I'm gonna try it, and then we'll take a break, and when we come back, because again, we're almost going for an hour now. When we come back, what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna come in during the break. I want to take a look at your user interface, right? For your assignment number 1. So, when after I do this build, I want to have a chance to go around and talk to everybody. I'm probably going to start, because I always start on this side of the room. I'm going to start on the other side of the room today, right? So for people who are on this side of the room, when we're on break, please go get your coffee, do your things you have to do. And then by the time I get to you, you're ready, and these people can go to get a coffee and everything else, because I don't want people waiting around for nothing. Okay? Guru meditation. Yeah. Oh, yeah, there's that too. What time? That's a great time to take a break then, around 9, right? So I'm going to try and get it done before that. Okay, so I want to do this Ionic Serve stuff, right? So I'm here I have to be physically in my app folder to do my Ionic Serve. I can't just do it from here. I'm in the desktop. So I have to change my directory, CD, to my app, which is COMP3025 W2017 lesson 3A. I got to go in there, right? I'm going to clear the screen. Actually, I won't clear the screen so you can see the commands. And I want to just type Ionic and then serve. And when I type Ionic serve, I want you to see what I get here, right? So it starts the transpilation process. It starts the build service. It uses Webpack, and then it displays everything in my browser. So this is your basic app, right? So my scaffold is done, right? I've got basic iconography at the bottom. And you can see now that I have a basic Ionic app with very simple styling that's here at the bottom, right? So notice I have my home, I have my routes for about, I have a route for contact, right? All these things are kind of working, and it's all inside of a mobile first framework, right? Didn't take long. Okay, like literally that's what it is. Okay, cool. All right, that's one part. Now notice what my dev server locally is running on localhost 8100. That's the default port in my case. Your case might be slightly different, but it should be something like this. Notice that I've also, these are the commands that are running in the background. When I put Ionic serve, it does this, right? Ionic app script serve, and then version 2. I use my address. I can specify all these things. I can specify a port. I can specify live reload if I really want to or not. But everything, when I do Ionic serve, it does all this stuff in the background for me. Okay, so that's something that's running. So again, that's why this is working. I'm going to stop this service for a second and go back to the PowerPoint, and then we'll stop. So again, side menu is a very common template, again, for when it comes to using things for some kind of a tablet device. I like it, right? What I'm suggesting now is when you make your app, so after I've done my app like this, and let's explore it a little bit. So I want to talk about what it looks like, right, before we pause for a break, Okay, and I know that there were lockdown testing and all that stuff's happening today. So I got to find my app that's somewhere on my messy desktop, and here it is, right? So here's my app. And again, I'm going to use Visual Studio Code to kind of drag and drop it in, and I want to explore it a little bit with you, right? Because this is part of the understanding piece, right? So I'm going to kind of drag this in, right? And there's Visual Studio Code, and you can see that it has things already built in that you would normally have in Visual Studio Code. One of them is a package.json file, and you can see what it has here. So here's a bunch of scripts. Remember, for who remembers how to do Node applications, we did kind of Node. And if you look at scripts, these are exactly what was happening here. When I said Ionic serve, that is my command. It's a script command. And what it actually does is it launches Ionic app serve scripts. App script serve. Sorry, that's what it really does, right? That's on the background. I can also do a clean, a build, different things from a script perspective. Here are our dependencies. Angular common, Angular compiler, Angular compiler CLI. Like these, if you're going to do this by hand, guys and girls, it's a little bit daunting, right? There's a lot of things you have to put in here. So you notice that it does core, the forms, the platform browser dynamic, all these things that it adds in. Ionic Angular is another thing we have in. Ionic native, right? Ionicons, right? That's what the icons are. And so on. These are all the things. Dev dependencies, we also have TypeScript at 2.09. That's not the latest version, but it's still TypeScript 2, which is good, right? So again, we're using TypeScript 2, Angular 2, Ionic 2. That's good, right? That we're on the right track. And also app scripts. Look at when it says at Ionic app scripts, so other things that are dev dependencies. Here are a bunch of Cordova plugins, and these Cordova plugins are going to be used when we actually deploy something live to an iOS or Android device. You need these plugins: status bar, the whitelist, console, the splash screen. All these things are built in. We can add additional plugins with Cordova and Ionic to access things like sensors and hardware on the devices, and that's a great option with Ionic. That's much easier to do than with PhoneGap. Right, PhoneGap, we can do it, but it's a little bit more challenging. And then notice that there's some platforms. We've talked about iOS because we loaded in the iOS emulator. That's one thing we've done here. And then here's the description. So that's package.json. We also have tsconfig.json. tsconfig.json I talked about. When you have TypeScript, you need a tsconfig file with some compiler options. Remember, TypeScript converts from
or have to access the video on their wireless device by visiting the Georgian College website.
Love it. This is a great place to stop, everybody. So let's do a little break while we're going and do this lockdown stuff, right? And then we'll come back when all this is done. All right. Thank you for listening and paying attention up until now.